Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a really great conversation with Adam Michaels and Shannon Harvey of the Los Angeles-based design and editorial studio Inventory, Form, and Content. The couple started Inventory, Form, and Content, or InfoCo for short, in 2017 to focus on graphic design, strategy, and content development, while also continuing Inventory Press, which is their really interesting publishing imprint. Both Adam and Shannon previously were a part of Project Projects, which was one of my very favorite design studios and where Adam was a founding principal. Their work has had a profound impact on me and how I think about design, as you'll hear us talk about in this episode. We also talk about their approach to their work, developing a sort of expanded practice, and how InfoCo is sort of a way for them to double down on their own design ethos. I really love this conversation and could have talked to them easily for another hour. As I said, I'm a fan, and it was an honor to have them on the podcast. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I like to think of as sort of the director's commentary for the podcast. Each month I share additional content, episode previews, and short essays and thoughts related to the themes of the podcast. These memberships really help keep Scratching the Surface going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this really fun conversation with Adam Michaels and Shannon Harvey. I was thinking about this conversation. I was kind of thinking about what I wanted to talk to both of you about. And I realized that I discovered Project Projects when I was a senior in college, and this was 2010. And so essentially, and I was kind of blown away. This was right when the SALT identity came out. And I remember seeing that and then going through the archives. I had no idea who these people were, and it was completely different than the type of design that I was taught. I came up through a design program that was a very kind of traditional, rooted kind of Bauhaus modernism idea where design was invisible. You're not kind of necessarily bringing your own point of view into this. You're translating someone else's ideas. And so I saw this, and it just completely kind of shook everything that I thought I had just been studying. And I feel like in a lot of ways I've been kind of carrying that through my career, trying to figure out how to reconcile these two approaches to design that I had kind of been presented with. And so I kind of would like to start there a little bit, and this is such a weird big question to open with, but I would love to hear kind of how both of you kind of got into design and arrived at this kind of different way to approach it than is maybe what's considered, the traditional or standard way of approaching design.
Yeah, well, let's see. I mean, going way back in time to start to answer the question. I grew up in a household with a lot of books and a lot of records and a general, sort of like trappings of. It definitely wasn't the hippie era anymore when I was growing up in the 80s, but a lot of those kinds of trappings were still around. And, my early exposure to media was definitely of this kind of like outside of the normative kind of way. So starting, from that as a child into becoming a kind of a little bit angsty punk rock teenager back in the early 90s, and this is in the Chicago suburbs that this was occurring. Basically, again, like just as I sort of got deeper and deeper into media in general, it was not mainstream media. It was not. I wasn't really looking at things like corporate branding and being excited about that as a kid. I was excited about, especially at that time, it'd be like 300 copies of a 7-inch record that someone silkscreened the covers on a paper towel in the south side of Chicago, like literally, and like that, and that stuff. I don't know. It's just like my mind was I was exposed to very mind expanding sorts of things from a kind of early age. So so as that kind of ends up like translating into what I've done as an adult, it's a very direct path in a way. It would have been much stranger to all of a sudden get really interested in. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I guess branding wasn't like a word when I was a kid, but to kind of
Right.
go that route, it just in a way like didn't even occur to me. And I went to art school in Minneapolis at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and which was a wonderful place to receive an education in design. And also Minneapolis being a little bit, it's in the middle of the country. It's a small city. It's extremely cold in the winter. It's a great place to get deep into various subject matter because you kind of really do just burrow in for about half the year into the indoors. It definitely wasn't a normative approach to design that the faculty was teaching then. It wasn't like the cultural scene in Minneapolis was fantastic. The Walker was always a really strong model for cultural practice and the kind of like weirder offshoots that come out of it, like weird yet rigorous offshoots of culture. And I remember even like one of my professors when I was sort of trying to wrap my head around like what is good typography, that professor just saying like, well, you should just like look at the Walker's calendar really closely every month. It's just that well worked out. Let's see, I've answered the question, sort of.
Yeah, can I ask? I have another question, Shannon. I want to ask you also, but Adam. I have another question that I think is interesting. That you were kind of surrounded by all of this stuff, and you were kind of seeing it. When did you make a connection that people made this stuff, and that was something you could do, or that design is what this stuff was called? How did that happen?
In an ambient sense, like something like the Whole Earth catalog, seeing that as a kid was pretty great as far as it really telegraphing that it's made by humans, and the hand is very apparent. It has a personality. It's a little bit sloppily put together.
Yeah.
So that from a super early age, I think it's kind of clear that it came from human beings and not from some kind of corporate monolith somewhere. I think, there was all kinds of wonderful things that I learned from the deep involvement in the punk scene in the 90s, but the DIY thing was just really major. And, there's numerous bands or like zines at the time that would say like, oh, you want to do a record? Here's how you do it. And it would just be, nothing theoretical at all. It would be like, here's the address for the pressing plant in Nashville, or you could work with this one in California if you want. Here's where we print our covers. Here's the 3 distributors that you can talk to then sell your record. So in terms of just like demystification of processes,
That's interesting.
The punk scene was a hugely important thing. So then, many years later, when working in New York and doing, in a way, like one of the propositions about my moving to New York was whether that kind of spirit could translate into working into this media center, this hub of the world, whether those impulses had a place within a much more, what's the succinct way of saying it? It's a more corporate landscape, but that's not really the thing. It's sort of just like, I guess maybe the thing I'm trying to say is it's a different thing to work on the periphery than work in the center of the universe, as Manhattan kind of continues to be. And so in a way, the proposition was like whether you could sort of harness the resources from being in the center of the universe and kind of filter in all of these more like countercultural impulses and content and approach and all that through the apparatus, the numerous apparatuses that New York City had to offer. And I think that was like, I was pretty skeptical about whether that would work when initially making that transition to New York. But that was like the super happy thing is actually it did in a funny way that projects did take on the life that it did, and then the publishing stuff we've done through Inventory Press subsequently is very directly asking the question of like whether those impulses and orientations can survive through through more broadly distributed, through mechanisms of broad distribution. And again, the answer is like, I mean, you might not make a lot of money doing it, but like, yes, you can kind of like put these pretty weird things, weird yet rigorous. That'll be the theme of today.
For sure.
Like putting those things out into the world, that's like totally possible. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it's so interesting hearing you recount this. Obviously, I know this story well, but the idea that you were coming from Chicago, it was a big city, and you were coming from this kind of like zine and punk rock place. And then I was growing up in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, which was much more a place of like nature and incredible landscape, and I was kind of culture starved as a kid, so I didn't even understand that a place like Chicago with that kind of density and like that scale of institutions existed. So I think my own design kind of origins were more about like how humanity existed in a landscape, and I was way more interested in kind of architecture and how humans survived in this broader world. But then it's funny, too, how we both ended up at the same place, which is the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, because I was coming from this place of architecture, not necessarily wanting to be an architect, but to research it and study it and embed myself in design. And exhibitions, for me, were the way to embed myself physically in design. And then the rigor of the CCA was also what really appealed to my kind of like the right side of my brain, I think. They're so incredible every level of detail of engaging designers in work, exploring themes from unusual directions and going really deep on topics, but in an accessible way.
Yeah, that actually is really interesting. So did you, when you were growing up in British Columbia, how did architecture become, was that kind of the early interest? Because you studied architecture originally, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think partly growing up in British Columbia, I was craving a city. And I think part of studying architecture was just understanding how people live together in social, constructs, essentially. Right. And I actually studied architecture, but with a focus on urban design. So I was always interested in, it's kind of like the facade relationship of buildings to where people actually exist, and questions of public space and shared values and how we kind of come together around this project of life on this planet. But I think for me, what's been really interesting is I studied graphic design actually as well, architecture and then graphic design.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
So it was always this question of representation and a little bit that like thin, visible layer of architecture that everyone has access to that I was most fascinated by, which has actually kind of parlayed directly into a lot of the signage work that we've been doing, because these kind of signage projects are ways for me to work with architecture, but bring a kind of graphic design sensibility to actually facilitating the movement of people through space.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I always hesitate when I hear people kind of talk about their background and trying to draw too clear connections, because I know they're not ever as clear as it sounds in kind of the retelling. But as I was researching for this, I saw, Shannon, that you had worked at OMA for a while, and thinking about that now, and then thinking about that in relationship to something like Inventory Press, there's an interesting similarity in OMA's model, and I'm not as familiar with like the actual kind of inner workings of that studio, but making buildings, but also making books and research, and that actually seems very connected to the way you're running your studio now too. Would you make those connections, or kind of talk about how those maybe are an influence? And then I think that then also comes back to like the zines and the just doing everything yourself. It like suddenly all comes together, but from two very opposite ends. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely. I think everything's connected. Do we talk about small, medium, large, extra large? Is that
I don't know. I haven't looked at that in some years, actually, but I mean,
But yeah, I think research as being fundamental to our practice is really something that does, in some ways, come from OMA. Specifically, I didn't work there for very long, just to clarify, but it was a really powerful influence on me, actually working within the AMO division there, to think about not only what you were making, which in that case I was working on exhibitions, but also you make an exhibition, then you make a book about what you did for the exhibition, and then you would work on a fashion show, and then you make a book about the website that was connected to the fashion show, and then you would put that on display at the show. And like these things that kind of are all interconnected as one kind of cohesive work of design, I think, is sort of how we think about things. We're always interested in working in different media and kind of playing out a design idea across different formats.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, traditionally one of our favorite things to work on has been actually we just did one in Venice recently for the Venice Architecture Biennale. We worked on the U.S. Pavilion there, and so we did all the exhibition design and exhibition graphics for the pavilion itself. We designed the website. We designed some kind of printed materials, and we designed and published the book for that as well. And it's kind of there is something particularly just like as a design task, particularly compelling about the idea of like you come up with a conceptual framework, you come up with a formal vocabulary, and then you get to play out what that does in very different physical situations, that of a book or a website or a three-dimensional space.
Right.
And that I mean just like thinking through the details of how something lives in different places is always super interesting. And for that, and actually I remember you had mentioned the inventory book series.
Yeah.
So we were very excited for the U.S. Pavilion that the curators, they actually sort of mentioned to us that, they really loved the inventory books paperback series, and would we be interested in kind of having the catalog for the pavilion kind of slot into that same format and that same kind of sensibility, and which was a wonderful proposition to receive, because that was something that I put a lot into a bunch of years ago, and those books were very important projects to me, but they were also kind of grueling, so they were something that I sort of did and then put down for a little while. So it was nice to be kind of asked to pick it up again in a slightly different way a little bit later on.
Oh, see, that's interesting, because I wanted to talk about those books next, and kind of especially talking about AMO and the way you would do an exhibition and a book, etc. And I was thinking about inventory books, and I have all of, or I guess there were 3 from the original set. I don't have the green one. That's the only one I don't have. But I'm curious about the trajectory of that project, and if I might be drawing too much of a connection just because of using the word inventory repeatedly, but how that started as a series of trade paperbacks and then became a publishing imprint, and now your studio uses the name inventory, where those things are starting to seem like they're coming together more and also getting a little bit more expansive in their ambition. Can you kind of talk a little bit about maybe how that came about originally as a book series and how that's kind of grown and kind of reshaped how your work looks, or the way you think about your work?
Yeah, definitely. So Inventory Books was originally, it was a series, as you say, it ended up being 3 books. All 3 of them were published by Princeton Architectural Press, and basically at that time, I think maybe when I pitched it, I don't know if it was 2008 or 2009, something like that, but 10, I don't know. Anyway,
so you actually kind of initiated it. You pitched these
exactly.
ideas. Okay.
And it had, I guess at that point I'd been, projects had been around for a few years, and it was sort of, it felt stable. It sort of felt like something that existed and worked, and it was kind of a good moment to start thinking about branching out into other, more expansive ways of practicing design. And and similarly to what I was saying before in terms of picking up like that whole DIY idea. Yeah. I mean, this was still the early 2000s or late 2000s, so it kind of there still were those threads of like, I don't know, which were like both promoted and debunked, but the whole designer author discourse that was still in the air to some degree. And in a way, maybe a proposition of those books was, it was more, what was it? I think there was the Benjamin essay, Designer as Producer. I remember that being influential on my thinking back then. And a step further than that, just actually designer, well, whether it's designer as editor or just very simply like a hybrid designer editor role, and that sort of being that, I guess at that time I sort of formulated that as a way to kind of work more expansively and work in a way that in which I could sort of be the catalyst of synthesizing form and content and kind of putting a book together in a way that traditional workflows of professional book publishing don't really allow for that kind of synthesis as being the kind of operating principle. So at that time, I mean, I was reading a lot of theory, reading a lot of history, and kind of I was young still. I sort of had all these ideas. I had a little more time. I mean, it really was a different era from now for sure. And in a way, it's kind of funny because I'm sure I was thinking about it in a pretty grandiose way, but in an appropriately sort of like funny way, it was sort of like this grandiose idea was to make these tiny books.
Right.
And
accessible, affordable, tiny books.
Yeah, and I think and I'm sure there's all kinds of embarrassing notes from that era about like this is the best thing that this is what a designer should do. And all that's been tempered with time, but it was like a lot was kind of wound up in that particular series. And it also was just like, I mean, the great thing about working in New York at that time was that book Street Value, that came out of a long-standing collaborative relationship with the Center for Urban Pedagogy, which was still the main people doing that then were Rostin Wu and Damon Rich and there was we did this project Street Value also with Meredith Tenhor, which was this like comprehensive history of this very small bit of Brooklyn, Fulton Mall. Which I could say more about, but maybe if this isn't a 5-hour podcast, maybe I won't go into those details. But that book came, like, basically we did a really interesting project. It actually was an exhibition that was about Fulton Mall and took place on Fulton Mall. The format of it was these like posters within the existing street furniture there. And we just, from all that research, there was a lot more to say, so it was very natural to do a book project out of it. And from there, it was very natural to say, if we're going to do a book, it should be this very considered, very deliberate, unusual framing, or like the best possible framing for this material.
Right.
And at the same time, we were studio mates with Work AC. We were involved with their Public Farm 1 project, which was in the Young Architects Program series at PS1, where they built this working organic farm in the courtyard of PS1. So we were around for that whole process, and it was an interesting process. So that led to that book being sort of this narrative of like how this kind of improbable thing came to be, and in this very integrated text and image kind of flow.
But yeah, just thinking about setting up those situations, it's very organic how you describe it, but it is an unusual situation that there's this broad range of material that through a kind of experimental process, editing in the case of PM1, because it was really like an oral history project, coming to a book-like conclusion. Which is something that we are still kind of practicing as part of the Inventory Press ethos. We're kind of not afraid to do something a little bit differently, which one example of which should I talk about it. We're kind of pushing forward with this sort of writing a book, not knowing what the outcome is, but writing a book from a kind of unusual perspective. So we hosted for 3 days in July David Reinford at our former offices in Los Angeles, which were the former offices of Richard Neutra.
Right.
Amazing space with this incredible 1951 kind of aura to it. We had David come out, and there were students from Otis, Art Center, CalArts, as well as a variety of sort of friends and graphic designers in the audience. He basically performed his entire Princeton graphic design curriculum over the course of 3 days. So it was 18 hours of David Reinford speaking, sharing slideshows.
Yeah.
There were questions from the audience. There was quite a bit of engagement on site, but it was a very kind of arduous process for David.
Yeah, his voice was somewhat wrecked by the time Sunday came around. It sounded painful. He said it didn't hurt, but it hurt. But we did. There was a lot of in LA these days. There's a lot of kind of expensive juice that can be purchased. So we got the most expensive juice we could buy for David, and
it did the trick.
It did the trick. It worked. It was worth the money. But the whole thing was. It was like sort of, there was an endurance test element to it, but it was actually like just super fun. It was kind of like, actually we just got a note from someone who said it was, what did she?
It was the best 3 days of her life.
It was the best 3 days of her
Oh,
life.
wow.
Which, it was almost the best 3 days of my life. I mean, it was so fun. There was a synthesizer break between all of the classes. So
I've been messing around with this Moog synthesizer lately, and that ended up being the palette cleanser between between lectures, which was kind of great because then the next day a new acquaintance of ours who was helping videotape or document. You don't say videotape anymore, do you? Because there's no tape involved.
Videography.
The videographer.
Yeah.
Anyway, the videographer, he brought like his synthesizer in the next day, and one of our collaborators brought his analog video synthesizer in also, which was totally mind-blowing, and none of us had ever seen anything like that before. But it was sort of like this really, serious yet quirky, but just incredible, 18 hours of really good graphic design curriculum, but punctuated with these like new age synth breaks, and then we brought food in. We got a donut sponsorship. Shout out to Donut Friend and Highland Park. It just kind of felt like this anarchic version of, which is kind of what, I don't know, maybe I always dreamed that's what school could be like, and that's kind of like why I went to art school, was hoping for that degree of anarchy. And we had a little less anarchy over the course of a whole semester maybe than in 3 very compressed days, but it was really fun. So anyway, Shannon was describing how that will eventually become a book.
And that's why that's interesting to me for a couple reasons. And I think one, it's a great example of just kind of the increase in ambition of what Inventory Press can produce. And it actually feels very connected. I hadn't made this connection before until just as you were speaking. In a lot of what the kind of blueprint for counter-education idea of this kind of alternative education model, and condensing David's curriculum into 3 days and doing this kind of marathon thing is like this really exciting idea. And I please don't take this question the wrong way, but why should that then become a book? Like, why is a book the form that this kind of like magical weekend turns into?
Well, I don't know. People learn in different ways. I would say that I still actually learn best reading. I sort of, the way that I take information in and have information stay with me remains reading a text and sort of spending time closely poring over it and thinking about it. I value greatly, the oral transmission of knowledge as well, but on a memory level, it doesn't work as well for me. That's like my subjective way of handling information. But
there's also, we're right now going through this editorial process that is involving a huge number of players, actually. So that is also something that I think could only happen when you're imagining this as a book, is that you have both the time and the space, and you kind of engage with others in the developing of a book that is only going to make it richer then, I mean,
Oh, you mean in terms of like just the audience and kind of involving?
Well, I mean, we're bringing in some of the audience, but also that we're involving a number of editors, a number of kind of advisors in the project. It's not something that you can do instantaneously on the fly while that performance is being given. Mm-hmm. It's something that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of correspondence, it takes a lot of kind of exchange that I think a book kind of timeline, format, and expectation is kind of a unique container for that coming together.
To me, it even connects to why this project is a podcast in a way, because I thought, as I was doing this research, and it was similar. It wasn't over the course of 3 days. It was, 2 years of graduate school, but it was all this kind of random collection of things. And I spent a lot of time just thinking about what is the format that coheres this the best and also reaches the people that I want it to reach. And 45-minute audio conversation seemed like the best way to do that. But I still don't know if it actually is the best way, but it's been the way that seems like it had the legs that allowed it to go on. And so I'm kind of very into what you're talking about. And again, I don't mean to keep connecting back to other projects, but it's reminding me of the Electric Information Age book that then became an album that was also a performance. And how do you think about do you think about those as separate, like, does the format make something different, or is that all one thing? Is David's 3-week event, is that a different thing than what the book will be? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the thing is, like, basically always having everything be let me see, what's my broad statement? It's sort of, to express a given set of content, you've got to figure that there's a better way to express, any content has its best home in a sort of way. And I'm thinking about, I mean, with the Electric Information Age book, it was very apparent that, a small experimental paperback book is the best possible place to present the content of other small experimental paperback books. And the kind of affordances that allowed of like having this montage of montages as you sort of flow through these different books within the space of one book and sort of experience the sense of multiplicity within the singular. And so, in that case, I would say that's the best possible place for that material to live. It was almost like a humorous offshoot that we did that record because it was a historical nice little piece of information was that with the Medium is the Massage, which was the centerpiece of our book, that there was an LP of the Medium is the Massage that also came out, which isn't you wouldn't call it a great record in the history of records, but it's a kind of wonderful historical thing that exists. So that was inspiration for us to have that similar sort of parallel in media. But yeah, I mean, thinking about something like Blueprint for Counter Education, I mean, that also, one of the so Jeffrey Schnapp and I we came across Blueprint when we had been doing our research for the Electric Information Age book, and there's just a little tiny bit about Blueprint within the earlier paperback book, but basically we just thought it was such an interesting thing in and of itself that we knew we wanted to do a project around it somehow, and we'd struggled for a while to go, is an exhibition the best thing to do with this? Is a kind of limited, we just like reprint the posters and put them in the Ziploc bag was like something that came out. It was like a lighter weight way of doing it, but then we realized that the original, there's really nothing like it in a funny way. Like it's such a particular thing, and the format is so bound up, like we're unbound with that material, that we realized, if we're putting this back out into the world, really just like putting the thing itself back out into the world was the most was really important. And that is when we ended up spending time with the original editors, Maureen, Larry, and the designer Marshall, and trying to figure out, like, since the original is such a strange, particular, unusual thing, like how on earth did that come to be?
Right.
And that story kind of forms the basis of the new book that we added into the expanded reprint. But again, I mean, that's a long way of saying that, just thinking over like talking about that project. I mean, the best way to sort of like put that content in front of people again was through that particular, reinvigoration of the thing itself.
Right.
One important part of the project that maybe we haven't mentioned yet is like the aspiration to do the book also comes from there not really being like a graphic design textbook that's just like there's not a good foundational graphic design textbook. So there's a very practical need for that out in the world. Like there's a void to be filled in that case. And when doing publishing, that's definitely, I mean, I wouldn't say like every single thing we've done fills like a gaping hole.
Yeah, that's not usually the first question.
Yeah. I was going to say.
But ideally, in a way, like the most interesting projects are, because I mean, in a way, like I think Blueprint did fill in a gap of like intellectual and graphic design history, and there's all kinds of important trajectories to that. So so I think that it actually in our little within our little world, it actually is kind of important to put that back in front of people. And in the same way with David's book, again, like we just don't like it. Actually, it would be very useful for this to be like something that every someone who's new to graphic design, starting out learning about it, has like some of these foundational bits of information like that. That's a genuinely useful thing to try to do at least. So
yeah. I love the way you kind of articulated that, and it's a nice way. I want to talk about kind of the studio now and the kind of the work you're doing now, and I have a theory about the studio that I would love, especially kind of hearing you talk about your background and kind of your interests and goals, that when Project split and you started Inventory Form and Content, that do you say InfoCo out loud, or is that just the URL?
Yeah, that's a good question. We weren't sure starting out, but then it takes a really long time to say Inventory Form and Content. So yeah, we do when someone asks us the name of the studio, we do say InfoCo.
Okay.
And
all right.
Kind of like the quick like utility company like aspect of the short version.
Yeah, I love that. I wasn't sure. As I was saying it, I got really self-conscious all of a sudden that I was saying it wrong. But my theory is, and it made a lot of sense when you announced the new studio, that in so many ways it felt to me like a return to the roots that you were kind of talking about originally, in this sort of kind of desire to really keep the studio small and to really focus on projects where you can kind of span that process from concept to editing to content to design, and kind of embody that DIY ethos that you kind of came up in. And it seemed like almost like a re-entrenchment of those, like putting our stake in the ground. This is the type of work that we're interested in. Is that at all correct? Or
yeah, no, I think that's a very accurate interpretation. And and there was always aspects of that were part of what ran through projects from start to finish. But well, I don't know. You could say we were the victims of our success in some way, in that it just kind of became an overly large and overly cumbersome structure, and we kind of just tested the boundaries of scale every year, and maybe added one person a year, and it's very sort of slow, organic kind of growth, and testing whether something was whether it was the right scale or the right fit or whatever, and I think we did just reach a point where it's like, oh, this is actually at this scale, it's not really. It just sort of felt like it wasn't working that well in terms of what you're describing, in terms of like ways of working, basically, and ways of engaging very closely with both form and content. I mean, inevitably, when a business is larger, you sort of, and you're sort of in the more like managerial position. I mean, it's just like towards the end, it was clear that it would only work if I was kind of managing other people doing work. And, we had all kinds of wonderful people at the studio, but it just didn't really allow for the kinds of hands-on approach to work that is what I like doing, basically. So
yeah, I think founding the new studio has actually been really exciting to do in Los Angeles. I mean, we were always really attracted to the city. It started coming out fairly regularly over the past 3-4 years, I guess, through a variety of projects that we were doing that were sometimes a little bit more physical or spatial, or took advantage of some of the light and air that we have here in LA. But that transition to a new environment has also been really positive for us, I would say. And just the change has generated a lot of new ideas, but there's very different rhythms in LA that I think we're still learning what those rhythms are. But so far they've been really conducive to our own desire to kind of engage deeply with what we're working on and a wide variety of ideas. So it's been really positive, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just nice that, I think maybe actually maybe in your notes that you had sent over, you had asked something about sort of client versus non-client kinds of projects. And I mean, and one thing in the new, well, I mean, again, maybe this would happen sometimes at the old studio, but now it's just a really natural flow between, whether it's an idea we came up with, whether it's something that came in externally. But, it's almost like client versus non-client doesn't actually feel like that strong of a distinction in some ways. It's just sort of, different projects have different configurations to them, and they all have their own, and they all sort of like flow together in a really natural way. So it's nice that doesn't feel like, that traditional dichotomy of like your non-client stuff is your interesting stuff, your client stuff is bread and butter stuff. I mean, it's just a really good flow between all of these different ways of working with people. And also there's just a lot of, I mean, the nice thing also of having a smaller studio is that when, something comes up and, if a project comes up that involves expertise that we don't have in-house, it's really nice and natural to call upon. We have a really nice, like, wide group of collaborators across, all imaginable media, really. So if there's something that comes in and it's a video project or, whatever it might be, there's sort of people that we can kind of pull into, a particular configuration for a particular project.
Yeah, it's the right person for that project.
Right.
It's been so nice. It's finding the right collaborator to really bring something to life in the way that it should, or the best way.
Yeah, and I think it's easier for people to have a little bit more, I mean, including us, for there to be a little more of a flow of different kinds of working relationships in LA than it had been in New York towards the end. I mean, especially just because, our rent in New York became extremely expensive for the studio by the end. So the financial stakes in general are, I mean, it's not cheap here anymore, but it's just a little bit more viable to have a little bit more of an open situation. Whereas, it had to be pretty well regulated in New York with the basic stakes of like monthly survival.
Yeah. No, I know what you're talking about there.
But that said, we're 7 people in the studio most days, and it's very busy.
Yeah, we're not. We'd like to say
busy.
that we're just sort of out here going to the beach and. But yeah, we've managed to bring our New York work ethic and work pace more or less.
There's just more sunshine in the lunch hour.
Yeah. Has working on whether it's books with the press or projects where you're kind of involved not just as designers but as like form makers, writers, editors, researchers, when you can work across that process, does that change kind of how you think about the work when you're not working, when you are hired just as a designer? And then B, does that change the type of people that come to the studio? Like, do people come to you now for all of that?
Well, yeah, the latter is easy to answer. I mean, yes. I mean, it does feel like the signals that we've put out into the world in terms of the range of what our interests are and how we like to work. Those signals it does feel like those signals have been received, and people do come to us with further ranging propositions than than just like, oh, here's your design brief, please.
Right.
Please give me design.
Right.
And wait, so that I answered the second half, which was the easy half. What was the first half again?
Has working basically across the process, not just in the design process, has that changed kind of how you think about, I guess, like what the work is in general, or, if you are asked to do just the design part of it, and I don't mean to make those so rigid as differences, but, as a designer, does the way you approach that differently now that you're also working in editing and researching and publishing and writing?
Yeah, I think, I think as you work in different ways, it can't help but sort of just like expand mental horizons, basically. But that said, I mean, sometimes it actually is kind of a relief when a project is just really straightforward and there is a really defined deliverable. It can actually be kind of nice to be like, oh, that seems simple and we can do that without going crazy. Okay.
Yeah.
Like that. Because I mean, the things that are.
I cannot tell you how glad that makes me to hear you say that, because I've thought that myself after working on these big projects, and I said to someone literally yesterday, I kind of just want to design a poster for somebody. Is that still a thing I can do?
I mean, I love stationary projects. I'll just put that out there. I mean, just really refining design on a page can be really satisfying.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like, I think if everything we were doing was extraordinarily complex, we would go crazy. I think if everything we were doing was extraordinarily simple, we would also go crazy. So I think the key is sort of always having a range of complexity and kind of just, and also scale of projects. Because some projects we do are like, 2 years or whatever,
400,000 square feet of signage.
Yeah. And it's kind of, and it's great to have that going on, but then it's also nice to have something that we're like, oh, okay, we can do this within like 3 months, start to finish, and it'll still be like a cool, satisfying thing. So I think, I think the key is just having a degree of a variety of scales and complexity at all times. That's kind of the best way to do it. And I don't think and again, it's not inherent at this point. I would say it's not inherently more satisfying to do a complex thing than a simple thing. I think maybe like 10 years ago, when there was like less crazily complex things under our respective belts, it would maybe have seemed like maybe we would have had more of a fetish for the complex at that point in time when it was like less familiar.
Right. That's interesting.
But
there's still a satisfaction at a certain scale that is kind of
not to downplay that satisfaction.
Right, of course.
But I think like when you're younger, I don't know, there was a kind of more, I don't know, there's more of a clear priority of like, this is what we're striving for, and this stuff, it's a little simplistic. I don't know about that stuff, but then you come to appreciate the simple things a little bit more, because you can start to see them for what they are, basically, rather than the simple things coming in and you sort of feeling this like lack with them that, oh, I wish it was this like massive, undertaking involving research and editing and writing and designing. When you've done that a few times, it's great to work that way, but it's just not everything can be of that scale, at least for our kind of operation.
I think you're exactly right. I feel like I've just started doing those kind of more complex things, and I'm basically working by myself most of the time, and I couldn't tell if I was desiring the simple things just because it was like overwhelming because I was suddenly doing these for the first time, or if it was maybe these complex things weren't as exciting as I thought they were. And so I feel like you've put some things into perspective just for me personally outside of this conversation that has been helpful. I have 2 more questions to wrap up. I'm kind of curious what kind of things are both of you thinking about right now, or what are the research topics or the things that you're kind of excited by and interested in right now, or what's next?
Well, I can say I've been thinking a lot about wayfinding and signage, partly because of this 400,000 square foot project we're working on.
Nice.
But I've been thinking a lot about systems and also just this interaction between people and architecture as part of that project, and trying to actually go through a history of graphic design and how it relates to signage and how that relates to history of architecture, and trying to understand the landscape of Los Angeles through that lens as well, because it's a landscape that's so conducive to signage because of the speed that people travel here. Everything changes in scale based on the speed of movement. So that's what I've been at least thinking about and trying to figure out what form that thinking will take next.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it's true. Yeah, and for both of us, I mean, Los Angeles as a topic is definitely in the forefront of our minds, being relative newcomers, and being aware of that, and just wanting to build up a kind of deep understanding of place in a way that, after, I mean, I ended up living in New York for about 17 years and had a pretty good grasp of it at that point. So it's definitely new. It's great to be in a new place, and invigorating and energizing to be in a new place. But yeah, you sort of want to be a good citizen and understand what you're kind of, what was here before you, and how you can kind of slot into it as a good member of a community. So yeah, a lot of our reading lately has been trying to go deep into the literature of Los Angeles.
I love that.
Yeah, so that has been fascinating. And whether it's there's the Good Rainer Banham book about
that's what I was exactly thinking of as you were saying this.
There's this book by Carrie McWilliams I've been reading called Southern California, An Island on the Land, which is just beautiful writing and fascinating history. And I started reading Raymond Chandler detective novels, which are also great writing, and provide some insight onto different parts of the city and how they operated some decades ago. So LA has been on our minds.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of just new stuff that we have coming up for publishing projects, is definitely we're still, I mean, obviously these are deeply fraught times politically, and we're trying to have our publishing output, I mean, as always, but we're definitely wanting the output to have a political bearing as well. So we have a couple things in the works that connect to that. I mean, a more contemporary project is that Museum of Capitalism book that we published last year. So that actually exceeded everyone's expectations in terms of interest, and it looks like it's about to go out of print. So we're starting to work on a expanded second edition with some new contributors, and trying to build that out for some future iterations of the show. So that, we're excited about that. There's a book that I think it's slated for fall next year by there's a graphic designer and educator named Danielle Aubert, who she's based in Detroit. She teaches at, I believe, Wayne State University there. And she did an exhibition maybe 2 years ago about, there was a sort of editor and printer named Freddie Perlman who was working in Detroit, and I think also Chicago, in the 60s and the 70s, and I guess through the 80s, and did these... He was actually the first to publish an English edition of Society of the Spectacle, and inserted illustrations that were sort of that were not part of the original Guy Debord text, but kind of had put his own little twist on the book in making the translation, which I think maybe Debord was not psyched about. But it's a really remarkable document, of course, and just some of his printing experiments. He's sort of almost like this lefty DIY version of Bradbury Thompson, and in terms of just play with CMYK and different alignments of plates and things like that. So it's actually, from a graphic perspective, some of the work is really interesting also. So Danielle did an exhibition about him a couple of years ago, and we're working with her on a book version of that exhibition, or there'll be a lot more material in the exhibition actually for the book. So she's writing that now. But yeah, that's one of the upcoming things that we're excited about. So there's a few things where graphic design is the subject matter a little bit more directly, but a kind of critical or political take on what graphic design practice can be.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I think you're right. Like that feel again, it comes back to what you were talking about earlier. Of it, I feel like that both of those really kind of fill a void where there's definitely kind of something missing. And you started answering my last question a little bit, but I'm curious, and this is a question that I always end the podcast with, of just, what are some of the books or the authors or writers who have just kind of really influenced and shaped basically how you think about all of this stuff that we've been talking about? Are there people that you find yourself kind of returning to again and again, or books you find yourself keep going back to?
You want to go first?
This is only standing out because I'm looking at it on the shelf, but we've been thinking about Bruno Munari a lot lately.
Oh,
this
nice.
is also a topic that David Reinford covers quite extensively in his classes, but I think there's a kind of playfulness, a little bit of absurdity, but just a very particular sensibility to his work that we've always admired. And we do try to bring a little bit of that lightness and sort of accessibility to everything that we do. So I would say he's a tenant for me.
Definitely, yeah. I guess in terms of like long-standing influence, I sort of, maybe I first think of Lester Bangs and
Nice,
and Greil Marcus, because I guess I got into Lester Bangs before Greil Marcus, but Lester Bangs was like, he writes about aesthetics at a really high level of thinking, but with a real gut level impact in terms of analysis and impact. And there was always this rich, as he sort of, he didn't live that long, but in his later writing, there's this really rich like thread of just like thinking through what ethics can mean within like, a kind of unruly rock scene the punk rock scene or whatever. That writing was deeply influential to me definitely as a young person, and it's definitely stuck with me since. From there, Greil Marcus is his, like, especially Lipstick Traces is such a like insanely brilliant way of kind of synthesizing all of these all of these threads of sort of non-normative activity over, spanning decades and countries, continents, and like saying that like, what the surrealists are doing relates to what this band Lilliput is doing in Switzerland in 1979, and actually that's a pretty direct lineage. That was a bad example, but again, like this idea of this like current of underground or whatever alternative ways of thinking, how you can trace that as a thread through all of these diverse situations, basically, and that's still being super important to me, that way of thinking, because it does kind of tie together. If you're sort of organically like interested in music, design, architecture, art, all these things. I don't know, Greil Marcus sort of helps to provide like a conceptual underpinning for how those things relate to each other and connect in spirit, if not in terms of like direct connection or direct step-by-step lineage.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Rainer Banham. I like Rainer Banham a lot.
Yeah, he's this was a great mix because Banham comes up on the podcast all the time with this question, and you would think Munari would, but he does not come up as often as I think he deserves to. So I love that we hit both of them.
And Robin Kinross. I kind of think I hope that every young designer reads Unjustified Texts. Because it's a compilation of essays from different places. It's not the easiest thing to read sort of cover to cover, but there's numerous essays in there that really deeply shaped my thinking about typography.
Yeah. There are a lot of people who I'm mad that I like didn't learn about their work earlier, and Kinross is one of those people that I just feel like I'm always kind of finding new things that he's written, and I'm just like, why did no one tell me about this 15 years ago? Like, why was it I was out of school for a couple years before that name ever came across my screen or my desk or whatever.
Yeah, everything by Hyphen Press is also
Oh, yeah.
so influential. I mean, for us, I think it's part of the reason that we do publish is this idea of sort of,
Right.
I really do hope that people do still read those books. I think it's still in print. I think you can still get it.
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. This was such a fun conversation for me. Like I said at the beginning, I feel like I've been kind of influenced by both of your work for, essentially, majority of my working career, and have kind of just loved the way you think about these things and the way you approach your work, and have been wanting to have you on the podcast for a while. So thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was totally a pleasure for us as well.
It was great. Thanks so much.
This episode was recorded on October 4th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.